Hi, everyone. Welcome to my session. My name is Anthony Viviano, and I'm a senior interaction designer at Bloomberg in New York City. And so today I'm going to talk about designing in an enterprise versus a digital agency or a startup. And this is really in the perspective of somebody who's sort of new to design, a junior person, maybe a career switcher. Things to consider that you might want to think about when you're choosing that first role. So why don't I first show you my agenda here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about me, so I can give you a little background on why I have formed these opinions. I'm also going to define the various types of companies that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll talk about what to look for in a UX role, and then how does each type of company sort of measure up to what you want to look for in that first UX role. So first, a bit about me. I've uh, I've been out of college since 1999. I started out not as a designer, though. I started out as a technical writer and then a business analyst. But I want to just focus in on my design career. I'm a career switcher, like many of you are working on. So I switched over to design. I started learning design in around 2006, and I made the full switch in mid 2007. And I worked at various companies along the way. Some I repeated, but I worked at various companies along the way. As you can see here, my longest stint is at Bloomberg, where I am currently. Um, so when it comes to enterprise, I've worked at a few different enterprises. Obviously, Bloomberg is an enterprise, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean by an enterprise in a moment. I also worked at a consumer brokerage house in the United States called TD Ameritrade. I worked at a few other places, a bank, automotive supplier. So these were like the large enterprises that I worked at. I also worked in some agencies along the way. When I say agencies, I mean like digital design agencies. So I worked at a few of those. Um, that kind of gives me the background of what I know about agencies. Now, I've never worked at a startup, so you might wonder why I can feel like I can speak on the startup. Well, a lot of that has come through what I've learned as a mentor. I've spoken to so many individuals along the way who, uh, you know, their first job, they're considering their first job as a startup, or they've started their first job as a startup at a startup, and so I've learned some of the challenges that you all face if that's the choice that you decide to make. So next, I'm going to kind of define the various types of companies that I'm going to focus on. So enterprise, what do I mean by that? So an enterprise is a company like Bloomberg, where I work, where there are multiple offices. It's usually global. If not global, it's very large. They have large technology organizations with thousands of developers. Uh, the company that I work for, we have about 100 people in our UX department. Some have more, some have less, but there's usually a good number of designers that you work with. Um, these also apply to like large tech companies, this sort of same kind of parameters. But some characteristics that are interesting and worth noting is in an enterprise, revenue comes from clients. So it comes from sales, your users. More users you have, the more money the company makes. And the business needs also come from clients via your sales organization or your service and support or your product business people. They sort of bring the business needs to you as designers. There are many stakeholders. As I mentioned, there's sales, there's business, there's service folks, there are technologists, and there's usually a very complex software development lifecycle, which can take some time. It's not easy to get something out in the world quickly when there's a complex development lifecycle. Um, what do I mean by an agency? Digital agency usually are focused on digital design for companies. Often they're marketing companies. They have a few offices, but their work is often focused regionally. As an example, when I worked at an agency in Detroit, I was focused on automotive things. So, it's usually regional. Um, they're smaller design teams that are often led by creatives. The development focuses on the front end because often that's what an agency will deliver is the front end. So there are fewer in-house technologists. What are some of the characteristics, though, worth noting? Well, the business need often comes from your client, not from your users. So your client brings you this business need, and you're paid by the client for what is delivered. And that's a significant thing to note, and I'll talk more about that later. And often an agency is very deadline driven because if you don't get your deliverables done on time and deliver to the client, you often are penalized and don't get paid. So the company is very driven to get something done on time. And then what do I mean by a startup? Well, I think many of you are familiar with a startup. What a startup is, obviously. Often they are just one location, especially if they're new, or could be remote. They only have a few employees. They often have a small design team. In my experience, I've noticed that many only have sometimes just one designer, or one junior designer. The characteristics of these startups, they have only a few stakeholders because they're often smaller organizations. So the founders, the investors are the stakeholders, but there are also some business people probably involved. I've noticed that the software development process is very quick. There's a real drive to get product out onto the market, into users' hands. So they operate on tight deadlines. They want to get that product out there fast, which is great for feedback. And there's immense pressure to get it right and to quickly pivot if you don't get it right the first time. So that sort of gives you an idea of what I mean by the different types of companies. Now, as a new designer, somebody who's transitioning to design, what's important? What are the things that you should be looking for in your career? Well, one of the things that's important, I've kind of bucketed it in two areas. One is user advocacy. We are all user advocates as designers. So good, to be good user advocates, we need access to users. We need access to user data. We need a user-centered design process, and we need to know the domain. And then the other bucket is your ability to grow as a designer. So in order to grow as a designer, you need feedback. You need feedback from designers. You need mentorship. I'm not talking about ADPList membership. I'm talking about mentorship within your company, senior people that can mentor you along your journey. You need performance evaluation. So your manager needs to sit down with you on some kind of regular basis and let you know how you're performing and give you feedback on that. And it's also good if you're new to design to grow to have a lot of variety in the projects that you work on. So let's look at each one of these: enterprise, agency, and startup, and see how they sort of measure up in my experience. Again, this is my experience, so I'm not going to say these are hard and set rules for every situation, but they're things to look for when you're looking at uh, a job, your first job in design. So first of all, in an enterprise, how do we measure up with user advocacy? Well, access to users, it's not impossible. It's actually often very available to you to have access to your users. You may have to jump through some hurdles. For example, you may need to go through compliance depending on what kind of company you work for. You may need to talk to your sales and product people who can give you names of users that you can go and reach out to, or stakeholders. You may need to go and recruit the users yourself, things like that. But usually in an enterprise, you have access to users. It's not a quick process to get to those users, but often you can get to those users without a lot of barriers. What about access to user data? Well, often the user data exists and it's available to you. You may need to learn certain tools to access it. You may need to work with certain organizations like data science or engineering or analytics folks in your company, but often you have access to good user data where you can look at metrics and try to understand usage. Often I've found in the enterprises that I've worked for, they have a very solid user-centered design process that's very well established, especially on a team that's more mature. So that's really important for you to be able to advocate for users, to have an established user-centered design process so that you can do things like understand the context of users through that research that you would do at the beginning. That's really important to have a good process, and I find that enterprises often do because they're more mature when it comes to their design teams. And there's no shortage of domain knowledge. When you work at an enterprise, you often have access to a lot of subject matter experts that can tell you about your domain. This is a Bloomberg domain here that we're looking at. And I have access to people who used to work in Wall Street or work on Bloomberg Terminal. And I have, of course, access to users as well. So I get plenty of access to domain knowledge. Now, what about when it comes to designer growth in an enterprise? Well, I find that because these design organizations are large, as I mentioned, We have 100 people in our UX department, around that, not that exact number, but because we have that large of an organization, I have no shortage of people that I can go to for design feedback. And I use that. We have regular design critiques that we use. I have regular meetings with individual designers to go over the designs and give feedback and get feedback. So there's no shortage of design feedback that really helps you to grow, that really helps you to learn the practice of design really well. And there's also no shortage of mentorship with these large organizations. Not every enterprise has a formal mentorship program, but there are often plenty of people within the company that you can tap and ask to be your mentor, or just ask questions that you would typically ask a mentor within the company. That's usually never an issue in an enterprise. And enterprises always have performance evaluation. Sometimes performance evaluation can be a stressful process, but it is valuable. It's good to know where you stand and how you're performing. So you don't shy away from that, not that you ever really have the option to. And corporations, large enterprises often have a very well-established performance evaluation project. Now, with an enterprise, there's one area that might be a weakness as far as your designer growth goes. You may not get a variety of projects. I know in my experience, when I enter a sort of business area as a designer, I stay in that area for years sometimes. I'm just now in the current area that I'm working in. I've been here for 5 years. So, that's great for domain knowledge. That's great for understanding the business. But as a junior designer, it's not going to get you a lot of variety in the projects that you work on. So that's something to consider. Now, what about an agency? When it comes to access to users, it's a little tricky with an agency. And why is that? Remember before I mentioned that design agencies are paid by their clients. They're not paid by the number of users. So the clients own that relationship with their users. And there's often a contract in place that stipulates exactly what you deliver to for your deliverables. So unless it's worked into the contract to get to do user research, it's often that you don't get to do it. So it's not always great. That's something to consider, something to ask about if you're looking at a job in a design agency. The same goes for user data. It can be tricky to get to that user data because you don't own it. The company you work for doesn't own it. The client owns that data, and it can be very sensitive for them to share it with you. Again, unless it's worked into the contract, it's something that the agency has established as something they can get from clients. You may not get it, and you may not be able to see it. A user-centered design process, I often find that it's pretty solid. However, given that there might be a lack of access to users and a lack of access to user data, it might make it difficult for you to understand the context of use and to specify user requirements or to do usability testing if you don't have access to users. Often you're mostly focused on the design solution and sort of getting your requirements and designing. And then when it comes to domain knowledge, it really depends again on the agency. I've worked for agencies that have very solid strategy folks, and they usually are very good at understanding the domain. Now, sometimes that's more like marketing knowledge, but it still will get you what you need to get started. However, it's not like talking to somebody who's an actual user or a subject matter expert. And sometimes you're able to do that from the client side, but again, that has to be worked into the contract, worked into the timing of your project. And then what about designer growth or agency when it comes to designer growth? So first of all, design feedback. Now, I found that while the design groups are smaller in design agencies, there's still definitely a variety of people that I've been able to go to for design feedback, and that definitely helped me in my career to grow as a designer. So that's always usually a possibility for you in a design agency. And the same goes for mentorship. I found that again, there's going to be more senior people. There's going to be some people that you can go to for design mentorship within your company. And so I find that's pretty helpful, pretty useful, and usually an option when you work at a design agency. Design agencies often have a performance evaluation process like any other company. So again, you're going to get feedback on your work. You're going to get feedback on your working style, the things that you do. So you'll get performance evaluation, which can be very, very valuable. Now, this is where agencies shine, is project variety. I know when I worked at an agency, I would engage with a client for a few months and then work on that design for a few months and then get to move on to another one. And so I was able to do a variety of different types of design work in a bunch of different domains, different styles, all kinds of different design. And so that was really great for portfolio building. Now, you have to be careful when you're building a portfolio like this, because of course you want your designs to be based on user feedback. So you need to see if you can find a way to do that. But you definitely will get a variety of portfolio pieces that you can look at. Um, Now, what about a startup? Again, I'm not the complete expert when it comes to startups. I've never worked in a startup, but this is what I've observed when it comes to startups. And I'm going to kind of group a little bit of this together for the sake of time, also because I'm not the preeminent expert in this area, just based on what I've learned. When it comes to access to users and when it comes to access to user data, what I've found is that it really depends on the founders of the startup, the leadership team of the startup, and whether or not they value that kind of feedback and that kind of information. Now, that's sort of built into startup culture to go and get feedback from your users. Now, a lot of that is market feedback. It's not necessarily the kind of user feedback that we like to get, but it is built into the culture, so it's not always hard to sell the idea of doing that. So you usually can do some of that. And what's nice is with a startup, your access to users is um, pretty much without any barriers. From what I've noticed, you can talk to your users pretty freely without having to jump through hoops like you might have to do in an enterprise. If the data is available, you can usually get that pretty easily without having to jump through hoops. So it can be great, but it really depends on who runs the company and whether or not they value that. So if you're interviewing for a design job at a startup, that's something to ask about. That's something to try and figure out. And then the user-centered design process, again, it depends on the leadership. They may not understand the user-centered design process because you might be the first designer that they hire. So you'll have to advocate for this. Uh, and so that's something that you have to know going in. Will you need to advocate for this yourself, or will this be something that's sort of already baked into their process? And then domain knowledge. I do think that it can be pretty easy. Often the company is sort of built from a domain. The founders come from a domain. So usually you can get to that subject matter expertise that you need pretty easily. So the domain knowledge usually isn't an issue. Now, what about designer growth? This is the area where you really need to be careful when you're working at a startup, especially if you are the only designer going into a startup as a designer. So, design feedback, mentorship, performance evaluation. Now, if you're the only designer and you're a junior designer, um, it's tricky because you're going to need design feedback from senior designers if you want to grow as a designer. The problem that I've noticed is that if you don't get that, um, you'll develop some bad habits that maybe you'll never know are bad habits until you try and work at a different company. So it can stunt your growth as a designer if you're not getting design feedback. So if you're looking at a role at a startup and you'll be the only designer in the startup, think about that. Think about how you can get that design feedback that you need. How long you'll be the only designer in that on that team. That's something to think about. And then also mentorship. Again, if you're the only designer within the company, you may not have a mentor. Or if you're one of few designers in a company, you may not have many choices when it comes to a design mentor. So that's something to ask about, something to think about when you're looking at a role like that. And of course, performance evaluation. Now, performance evaluation, is usually something that more mature companies do, larger companies do. So something to think about. Is there a performance evaluation process? do you want to be evaluated by someone who isn't a designer? So if maybe there is a performance evaluation process, but you're being evaluated by an engineer or a product manager. Sure, there's some value in that still, but it's not going to help you grow very much as a designer. So that's something also to consider. And then when it comes to project variety, again, I have to keep saying that I'm not the expert in this area, but from what I observed, it does seem like there's not a ton of variety because you're usually uh, working on a single product with maybe limited features. So you're not going to have a lot of variety. There's not going to be different business areas within an enterprise or different clients that you can go to like you would in an agency. You really are just working on this one product. So you're not going to get a ton of project variety. Um, that's something to think about. The good thing is usually the development process to get something out the door and out to users is pretty quick. So you may have some quick cycles where you'll be able to start another feature or another version of that project, or maybe a whole new feature area. So that can be good, but you're not going to get the variety that you'd get, especially at an agency, because they don't have that variety of clients. So sort of at a glance, just to kind of review what we talked about, when it comes to enterprise, this is my just s- simple grading here. You get good access to users and user data. There's often a well-developed user-centered design process. You often have good access to a domain, and I didn't mention this before, but often that domain can be complex, which is good for you as a designer to grow to deal with complex domains. When it comes to designer growth, you usually can have an abundance of feedback, maybe sometimes more than you want. You'll get plenty of feedback from your fellow designers, and you usually have a variety of individuals that you can use as mentors, and you'll definitely have a performance evaluation process. Of course, the one big drawback is you're not going to get much project variety, so you're not going to grow your portfolio as quickly when you enter an enterprise. It's more of a long term situation. When it comes to an agency, again, with user advocacy, um, you're often limited, or maybe you have no access to users and user data. So that's something to think about. We are happy designers when we're talking to users. At least I am. So if you don't have that, you might get frustrated. There often is a well-developed user-centered design process. However, that process is limited based on whether or not you're talking to users and whether you have access to user data. You often have some good access to the domain, especially if you have good strategists in the company you work for. But your design might not be very complex. And what I mean by that is often digital agencies, especially those that are working on marketing, they the design is very light, let's say, not light, but simple, because it's marketing pages. Now, of course, there are design agencies that work on products, so that wouldn't apply there, but you have to kind of ask those questions. When it comes to designer growth, you still get some good feedback because you still have a design team that you work with that'll give you feedback. You'll still get mentorship. There are probably some people there that will be good design mentors for you, and you'll definitely get performance evaluation because most companies have that. And the shining strength of an agency is project variety. You'll get to work on a lot of different stuff for a lot of different clients and a lot of different business domains. So that can be great for portfolio building. Um, but of course, you want to be careful with how you're building that portfolio, whether you're doing the full user-centered design process. And then a startup, everything kind of just depends. Depends on the leadership. Is the leadership UX savvy? Do they value the UX process, user-centered design process? Um, a lot of this depends on you. Do you speak up? Do you have a voice to say, hey, I need to advocate for myself? We're not doing this right. To do this right, this is the process we need to go through. You need to evangelize the design process often. So a lot of that will depend on you if you can make a success of that or not. And then designer growth. This is always the big warning that I give to the mentees that I speak to. They're considering a role in a startup, especially one where they'll be the only designer. Being the only designer is very challenging, um, especially if you're junior. It's going to be really difficult to grow as a designer if you're not getting the design feedback, the mentorship that you need to really grow. So if that's the situation that you're considering, think about whether that's something you want, and if it is something you want, if it's something that you can speak up and get what you need so that you can grow as a designer. I'm ending a few minutes early, so why don't we just go to questions? Thank you all for your attention. The questions are going to be moderated, I believe. So here we go. First question is, would you say it's best to start as a junior designer in a big enterprise system and then transition to more agency work and startup once you are turning from a generalist to a specialist? That's a good question, Mario. I don't think there's any set rule about which to start, which way to start. I personally started as a junior in a agency. And I found that helpful because, as I mentioned, I was able to build up my portfolio. It's also fun, if you're new to design and if you're kind of on the younger side. I'm not on the younger side anymore. It's a fun environment to be a part of, and you really do have a lot of fun. And so then that's what I did. And then I transitioned to enterprise. But I do think that to grow as a designer, there's tons of value in being in an enterprise or a large company. So I don't think there's a one set rule one way or the other. I think it really kind of mixed. I think you just got to sort of plan your career out and figure out what's best for you. And there's also something to be said for entering an enterprise and just staying in that enterprise and growing there. And we've definitely had people at Bloomberg that have done that and have grown rapidly as designers right into leadership. So I don't think there's really any one rule one way or the other. Another question. As someone starting in this career, would you recommend a startup or a bigger company to join? I see the benefits to joining an established company, but startups typically give better opportunities to entry-level designers. Daniela, that's a really good point. And this is why I think I run into this so often with my mentees, that it's often easier for a junior designer to get a job at a startup entry level than it is to enter an enterprise. As many of you have probably noticed, enterprises tend to like more senior people or people with experience. You often see the sort of memes on social media where they say keep entry level because enterprises will ask for entry level, but really want somebody who's experienced. And so it's true. It's actually much easier for entry level designers to enter a startup. That's why I never really discourage somebody from making that choice. I just try to help the mentee that I'm talking to understand what they're getting themselves into and to sort of strategize how they can go about still getting what they need to grow as a designer. So I do recommend that if it's possible to start in a bigger company, but I also recognize that it's not always possible. And sometimes you just need to get paid and you need to start working. So I totally get it, why you would want to do that. Startups can also be fun places to be as well for a first job. So I get that as well. These are just things to think about as you're thinking about that first role. What skills can transfer over from digital agency startup to enterprise level? I'd assume a person would have a broader skill set in an agency versus enterprise. Um, so I can only speak from my experience. When I transferred from digital agency to enterprise, the skills that transferred were my basic sort of wireframing, visual design skills. The basically the the technical aspects of my job that I can do that I can open Figma and work in a design tool, that kind of thing. Um, the things that well and depending on the agency you work for, you still sort of get an idea of the full breadth of the process. When I joined an enterprise, well, I was actually fortunate. The agency that I worked for had a contract that included user research at the end of my agency life. So I was able to do that, and I was able to transfer that skill over into a enterprise. Um, But often when you join an enterprise and you're coming from an agency, you have limited experience when it comes to gathering user data, doing user research. So that'll be something that doesn't always transfer. But your basic design skills always do. Um, Also, some soft skills will transfer. At an agency, you'll do a lot of presenting. You'll do a lot of presenting in any company you work for. So those soft skills of presentation skills, stakeholder management, those sorts of skills also transfer over. So it's really not a difficult transition overall. How would you recommend steering a situation where the senior designers are busy and don't have time to provide mentorship to juniors in an agency world? Um, yeah, that doesn't sound like a great situation. We're all busy designers. It, how would I manage that? I think that would be a good conversation to have with your direct leader, because it's in everybody's best interest that you grow as a designer. It's in the senior designer's best interest, it's in your manager's best interest, and in your best interest, because it only is going to help the company. The sooner you grow as a designer to the point where you can work on your own without any handholding, the better for everybody. If that's happening in a situation where you are, I would raise that issue to your leader, whoever your leader is, your manager, and just bring up that point that it's really in everyone's best interest. You have to advocate for yourself, but you also need to put it in the terms that the business will understand. Like, hey, this is good for you as well if I grow as a designer. So yes, we're all busy designers, but we all should be making time to mentor, and hopefully your manager would support you in that and be able to help you navigate that. Do you know of any enterprises or agencies that hire junior designers with less than 2 years experiences? I mean, I've certainly seen it happen. Uh, where I work at Bloomberg, we've hired junior designers that have less than 2 years experience. We do have sort of a base level of, you need to have a master's degree, um, for most people, not for everybody, but uh, I've definitely seen it. We do like to see some professional experience that's not maybe design experience. Do I know of any enterprises? I mean, I've seen junior people go to Apple. I've seen junior people go to a lot of the big tech companies like Google. We've hired them at Bloomberg. Um, the problem is that they're not hiring a lot. So that's probably what you're facing. And so you need to work with your ADPList mentors to practice your portfolio presentations and just keep at it over and over again. And eventually you'll find that you'll break in somewhere. So that was the last question. Thank you all for your attention. It was really great to be able to share my knowledge with you, and I wish you the best. Enjoy the conference.